Chapter 14. We glided along in silence for a long time, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The river had a few turns that Early guided me through, and even though we were heading upstream, the current was slow. I took nice, easy strokes, and we settled into our assigned stations, me rowing, him calling out an occasional command. It felt good to be the brawn of our duo and let Early set the course. I couldn't begin to guess what was going on in Early's mind, and every once in a while he would lapse into his absent stare. It usually only lasted 10 or 15 seconds, and then he'd be back, always as if nothing had happened. My mind meandered this way and that, to Pye and Fisher and Mom and Early, the strangest of boys. And yet here I sat, heading into the wilderness, rowing backward, facing Early. I didn't know for sure that Early really knew where he was going, but I was in it for the long haul. After what might have been a few hours, Early took the length of rope from his pack and began making intricate knots. The sun was rising, shedding light on the folly of our trip. It was one thing to set off in the middle of the night. It had seemed more like a dream. But now, as Early worked his knots, I had a knot of my own forming in my stomach. I rowed harder, trying to keep ahead of the feeling I'd had since the end of Early's last Pye story. Early looked up from his knots. "That's sad about Pye's mom, isn't it?" "Yeah," I said, my voice catching in my throat. "You're thinking about your mom, aren't you?" "No," I lied, nearly losing hold of an oar. "Yes, you are." "No, I'm not." "What was she like?" I looked up at Early. I'd never had to describe her before. Everyone I knew also knew my mom. She was just a normal mom. I answered, not giving Early's question its due. Then I remembered he didn't have a mom. She was pretty and smart, I guess. She knew how to take off a bandage without pulling off the scab. She didn't mind putting worms on a fishing hook, and she was good with words. Her high school teacher entered one of her poems in a contest. She didn't win, but said it was nice to be considered. "What happened to her?" "She died, that's all," I said, surprised to hear myself say it. And then I realized not only had I never had to describe my mom, I'd also never had to explain what had happened to her. I hadn't really spoken of her since she died. People had whispered their condolences at the funeral, but I hadn't been required to give a response other than "thank you for coming." Early, however, was not a guest at a funeral. "But what happened?" he persisted. "I don't know. All I could do was keep rowing to stay ahead of myself." Early was quiet, but I knew he was waiting for an answer. "We'd been talking down by the creek," I said, leaving out the part about getting lost during the scout camp out. "She said she had a headache and was going to bed early. But no one dies of a headache. The doctors said she had a brain aneurysm, that she died in her sleep." I lifted the oars out of the water to let the boat glide, but I wouldn't know because I wasn't there. I was absent, I thought, recalling the words in Early's Pye story. I was absent and I returned too late. I was supposed to be in charge. I was supposed to take care of my mom, but I wasn't even there. I was sleeping in the barn because it was cool there and because I was mad. When I went into the house the next morning for breakfast, it was still dark. Her chipped teacup with a little red flower was hanging on the hook by the sink. She hadn't touched it. I went to her room and found her in her bed. It shouldn't have happened that way. "You're right," Early said. "Those are two different things." "What are?" I asked, surprised that he thought I was right about anything. "Dying and sleeping. A person should be able to do one without the other sneaking up on him." I tried to imagine those words coming from my mom, tried recalling her voice. I realized I couldn't hear her saying it. Her voice was gone. I tried to focus instead on how many strokes of the oars I took, on how many times I pumped my legs forward and back, and how many breaths I took. Eventually, I guess I wore myself out with counting and pushing and breathing. Then I noticed Early pulling items out of his backpack. Honey, tobacco, lavender-scented ointment, jelly beans. What's all that stuff for? I said, trying to get my mind off my clenched gut and aching muscles. They're called provisions. Things you need on a trip, but you can also call them victuals, provender, necessaries, staples. In the Army, provisions can be called rations, but my favorite is foodstuffs. I know what provisions are, but all the stuff you brought, the honey, the tobacco, the jelly beans, what's all that for? Tobacco is for ringworm and poison ivy, he said, taking Bucky from his pocket. He poured a handful of water on the frog to moisten his skin. And the jelly beans? They're for Bucky. He likes jelly beans. Early held one out to the frog, who gave only a half-hearted croak. And the honey and lavender ointment are for snake bites. Oh, yay, I said. The rattlesnakes. Timber rattlesnakes, Early clarified. Everybody else seems to think there are no timber rattlesnakes in Maine. How come you're so sure there are? I knew my mistake the minute I asked the question. Lots of reasons. First, it's a matter of statistics and odds. There were 7 sightings of timber rattlesnakes last year in eastern New Hampshire and 12 in southern Canada. The odds of the timber rattlesnake not going past the Maine border are very low. I responded with limited enthusiasm. And timber rattlesnakes like quiet remote areas, especially deciduous forests with rough terrain. They find a comfortable habitat in open, rocky ledges where temperatures are higher, but they also like cool, thick woods with a dense forest canopy. Maine has both. Not to mention the migratory patterns of the timber rattlesnake, which indicate that. Fascinating, I muttered as Early wrapped up his informative segment on the timber rattlesnake. I yawned but tuned in again just in time to hear his closing argument. Bucky gets nervous when there are snakes around, especially timber rattlesnakes. He stroked Bucky's head. Bucky didn't look particularly nervous. In fact, he looked a little lethargic from the journey so far and hadn't touched his jelly bean that Early still held in his outstretched hand. I thought about suggesting again that Early let the frog go, but didn't want another lecture on fidelity. I continued rowing in silence. We'd stopped a couple of times throughout the day, but it was near dusk and we were both exhausted and hungry. Early's peanut butter sandwiches, apples, hard-boiled eggs, and canned beans were running out fast. We pulled the Maine out of the water and hid her in a patch of trees along the riverbank. There was a fairly decent clearing of grass and fallen leaves that would make for a nice campsite. The night air was clear and the temperature dropped quickly with the setting sun. I rubbed my hands together, trying to warm them with my breath as my stomach growled and my cheeks grew cold. I wonder how I'd gotten into this mess of a quest with Early. Let's get a fire going, I said, thinking maybe I should have just stayed back at school and been miserable for a week. At least I'd have had a warm bed to sleep in. Superman could build a fire with his X-ray vision, said Early. But then I would have missed out on this encyclopedia of comic book information. Yeah, well, Captain America would have to do it the old-fashioned way, and so do we. Help me gather up some twigs and grass. As I placed dry leaves and grass in a pile and shaped a twig pyramid above it, I was glad I had learned to build a fire, even though my road to being an Eagle Scout had taken a detour when most of the troop dads went to war. Not to mention the fact that I'd gotten lost on the first survival outing. Only Jimmy Arnold's dad was left, and that was because he got a ranking of 4F, which meant he was unfit for service on account of his vision. He was a banker and didn't know a mulberry from a whistleberry. The troop nearly fell apart when we were on a campout and he reached down to pet the nice doggy and had his hand bitten by a badger. Later, we thought he'd gotten rabies, but it turned out he'd just developed a nervous twitch. I pulled out my Swiss Army knife with its built-in can opener and cranked the lids off 2 cans of beans. We didn't have a bowl, so I set the cans in the dirt and warmed them near the fire. We divvied up the hard-boiled eggs and waited for the beans to warm. My mind went to Fisher Auden. I remembered his happy-go-lucky face in the picture of the trophy case as he held his championship cup. I wanted to ask Early about his brother, but thought it might upset him, and there was no record here to soothe him with its empty space. Plus, it was late and we were both tired. The beans went down good, and with full stomachs and the warmth radiating from the campfire, we stretched out in silence. Early on one side of the fire and me on the other. It reminded me of the painful, awkward silence after my mom's death. All the boys from the baseball team signed a card, but no one said anything. No one came over. No one even looked me in the eye. It was as if I had something contagious, as if somehow what had happened to me could happen to them, except for Melvin Trumbolt. He came to the house and found me picking cucumbers out of my mom's garden. He was the first person my age to drop by or even speak to me, and he said, "I'm real sorry about your mom." That meant a lot to me. The fire had burned down to glowing embers when I finally worked up the courage to speak. "I'm sorry, Early, about your brother." Early rolled over and said, "That's okay, we'll find him." I found that a bit confusing. "You mean you don't know where he's buried?" "He's not dead, Jackie. He's just lost." I sat up. "What do you mean he's not dead?" "Just like Pie. Haven't you noticed how Fisher and Pie have been on the same journey?" Early reached for his backpack and took out the leather journal. Remember when Pie first set off on his journey, but the sea knew he wasn't ready? Pie had a lot he needed to learn first. Well, look. Early held out a postcard from Dover, England. Fisher did the same thing. See, he says they were teaching him all kinds of things he would need to know, like how to eat on the run, run in his sleep, and sleep standing up. "I bet Pie didn't even know how to do that," said Early with the pride of a little brother. "Well, yeah, it's called boot camp, Early. All soldiers have to do that." "And see here," Early continued, as if I hadn't spoken, "after Pie built himself a boat, he set off on a great voyage. Let me guess. Fisher boarded a troop ship and sailed off into the sunset." "It wasn't sunset. I saw the newsreel at the Anchor Theater. It was really early in the morning, still dark, and they set sail on boats that can move in water and on land. See here, it was on June 6th, summer before last." "You mean D-Day. That was the invasion of Normandy. But that's not the same thing as." "And remember when Pie landed on that one shore and the people were unfriendly? Remember how they threw sticks and arrows at him? Well, look at this." Early handed me a worn newspaper article from the Portland Press-Herald that read, "Allied forces storm the beaches at Normandy. Germans answer with deadly force. Heavy casualties in first day." Heavy casualties, Jackie. That means those Germans killed a lot of them. But not Fisher. They missed him. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Early was shaping the Pie story to match what he knew about his brother's life in the army. I wanted to smack him, but my heart was breaking for him at the same time. I tried reminding him of the facts, but the dog tags, the letter. They tried to tell me he was dead. They must not have known. He said he'd come back. That's what he told me before he left. And now he's looking for the Great Bear, just like Pie. And when he finds him, he won't be lost anymore. The Great Bear. Now it was clear. The Great Appalachian Bear. Early, you need to listen to me very carefully. Are you listening? Yes, Jackie, I'm listening. They all say they're coming back. Every soldier says that, and they mean it. They want to believe it. It's just that not all of them make it back. I know that some of the soldiers die, but Fisher is still alive, and he's coming back. See here? Early said, pulling more newspaper clippings and notes from his backpack. His squad was supposed to blow up the Gaston Bridge along the Allier River in central France. With the direction of the current and the fact that there was a full moon that night, But I didn't care anymore about protecting Early's theories or his feelings. I'd had enough. "He isn't coming back," I yelled. "Yes, he is." "No, he isn't." "Yes, he is." "Early, Fisher's dead." "No, he isn't." Criminy, this could go on all night. "Look, you've got his dog tags. You've got a letter from the Army, just like every other family in that squad got dog tags and a letter. What makes you think you're so special that your brother should come home when the rest of them aren't?" "Because Pie isn't dead. And if Pie isn't dead, then neither is Fisher." Early hugged his knees and began rocking back and forth. "Oh," I breathed. That was why Early was so intent on proving that the Pie of his number story was still alive. That was why it upset him so much that Professor Stanton suggested that the number Pi would end. Early had said he was making up the story of Pi. He was just reading it. But I didn't believe him. I thought Early had said he wasn't making up the story of Pi, that he was just reading it, but I didn't believe him. I thought Early was making up a story. Until now. It was partly the way that Early told the story in words that didn't seem to be his own, but mostly in his inability to control the story. If Early needed Pie to be alive in order for Fisher to be alive, why didn't he just create the story that way? Because he couldn't. The story was not his to create. He was only retelling it, translating the story he read in the numbers. Early needed the numbers to continue the story Early needed the numbers to continue, the story to continue, and he needed Pie to stay alive. Because in his strange, convoluted, and amazing mind, if Pie were dead, that meant that Fisher was dead also. I knew it made no sense. I knew it was crazy, but how could I argue with him? Part of me wished I had some crazy story that would make me think my mom was still alive and that she would eventually come back. But my brain didn't work that way. I lay back, my heart pounding, as I stared up at the stars. It became clear to me that in joining Early in his quest, I'd certainly gotten into more than I'd bargained for. But I knew I wasn't ready to turn back. Don't get me wrong. I wasn't continuing out of any sense of fidelity, duty, honor, or any other of those words that Early liked to throw around. It was just curiosity and maybe a little fear of getting lost on my own. I had no need to stick it out or complete the quest. No, Early was the one who couldn't leave a frog behind. I would have cut Bucky loose in a heartbeat. And in this case, that would have been a better idea, because by the next morning, Bucky was dead.